This is part 2 of 3 on participles. In this video, we're going to look at the forms of participles. So we're going to be looking at a lot of different Greek letters, a lot of different Greek paradigms. It's going to seem a little bit overwhelming at first, but sort of as we move to the end of the video, I'm going to give you more tools for picking apart the different pieces of participles. And then and by doing so, you'll be able to identify the parsing information that, that makes up given participles. So my fair warning is you're going to see a lot of stuff, but I promise I'm here to help you, and I'm going to help you more at the end than I do at the beginning and the middle of this video. So when we're talking about the formation of participles, that is their respective different parts. I've given you 5 different parts that participles have here. This first one is optional. Sometimes it will have it and sometimes it will not, and that is reduplication. So if a participle does have reduplication, it is going to be perfect tense. So only if a participle is in the perfect tense is it going to have reduplication. Then a participle is going to have a verbal root. That is what we get the sense of the verb from, or what the meaning of the verb is. So remember, the sort of root of luo is lu, lambda, hoopsilon, like this. The root of pimpo is pimp, like this. So these are the verbal roots that are going to form sort of one of the building blocks to which other things can be added on to form a participle. And so a verbal root for participles is either going to be unchanged, it's going to be sort of in its basic form. There might be changes based on if a sigma is added here or something like that, but the root itself does not undergo a change as in the second aorist. So either you're going to have an unchanged verbal root or a second aorist verbal root. So if you have a change in the root or the stem altogether, that's going to signal to you that you have the second aorist. So those second aorist roots are going to be familiar to you. We're not introducing new second aorist roots. The second aorist roots that you have already learned for verbs are going to be the roots upon which participles are built if they are in the second aorist. So we're not going to be introducing new second aorist forms. So take heart in that. Prepositions may or may not, so I guess this one should probably actually be in parentheses too. They may or may not have a tense or voice morpheme, and there's different sorts of tense and voice morphemes that we'll look at in a little bit here. Many of them are going to be very familiar to you. Some of them are going to look exactly like other morphemes you've already seen, and some of them are going to look very similar to other tense and voice morphemes you've already seen with respect to indicative verbs. And then they're going to have a participle morpheme, and this is typically, to boil it down, it's sort of one of 2 different participle morphemes. So really, if you can recognize the 2 different participle morphemes, you're going to be able to figure out that a certain word is a participle. And then for their endings, to indicate case, gender, and number, they're going to add on those adjective or noun endings in the third declension, the first declension, and the third declension. So this is going to be one category of participles that are going to use third declension endings in the masculine and the neuter, and first declension endings for the feminine, and another category of participles that use second declension endings for the masculine and the neuter, and first declension endings for the feminine. So these are all our sort of basic building blocks of the participles. And so here what I'm going to do is give you the forms of participles based on whether they take 3-1-3 endings, that is third declension, first declension, third declension endings, or second declension, first declension, second declension endings. So that's how we've categorized this in what I'm going to give you here. And here's the part where you're going to start to get overwhelmed by all of the forms. So go ahead and pause and take 3 deep breaths before we go into all of these different forms. I'm going to pause and take 3 deep breaths as well. Actually, you know what? I'm not going to pause. Let's do it together. 3 deep breaths. And in, and out, and in, and out. I imagine that's what a Peloton coach does or something like this. So for our forms of the different participles, we're going to have the present active participle is going to be formed with the verbal root. It's not modified, so not a second aorist root. It's going to add an omicron, a nu, a tau for the masculine and the neuter, or this us for the feminine. And so this parentheses indicates the feminine here. And then it's going to add on those third declension, first declension, third declension endings. And our next one, so I'm giving you sort of how these form, and then I'm going to give you these paradigms after we walk through how each one of these forms. A second aorist active participle is going to look almost identical to a present active participle. The only difference is going to be that you have a second aorist root rather than an unmodified root. So for example, we've often used Lapo, which its second aorist form loses that epsilon. A form of present active participle of Lapo is going to look a whole lot like the second aorist active form, but it's going to be with lip as the root instead. For the first aorist active participle, we have the verbal root that's not changed because we get the sigma alpha of the aorist added on to the sign for the participle, which is going to be nu tau for the nominative, or not the nominative, excuse me, the masculine and the neuter, and the sigma for the feminine, then with those third declension endings added on in the masculine and the neuter, and the first declension endings added on in the feminine. The first aorist passive participle is going to use an unmodified verbal root, so not a second aorist root. It's going to use theta eta or theta eta iota as the sign to the passive. And then it's going to use the nu tau or the sigma as the sign to the participle. So you'll notice that we have sort of a theme or a thread running through here of nu tau, nu tau, nu tau, nu tau. Sigma, 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 sigma as our signs to the participles. And all of these ones that are in the aorist, so these three here, this one's present, but these aorist, notice that they do not have an augment. It's just straight verbal root. The augment only occurs in the indicative mood. This is going to be important, and it's going to be really helpful for your identification of different moods. And I'll say that again. The augment only occurs in the indicative mood. So we don't have the augment here because participles are not indicative verbs. Therefore, they do not get augmented to indicate past time. And then moving on to the perfect active participle, we have reduplication first. This is the sign of the perfect. Then we have an unmodified or unchanged verbal root. And then we have this kat or quia as a sign to the perfect participle, the perfect active participle specifically. And then those 313 endings added on. So what this looks like when we come to actual paradigms, I'm going to go through each one of these. Let's see, it was 5 I gave you. So we're going to go through each one of the 5 very quickly here. What I've given you up here is how each one forms. So the verbal root plus aunt or us in the feminine. So notice that the aunt is over here. The us is here in the feminine, and then the aunt over here again in the neuter. So you see third declension, first declension, third declension. So what we have is the verbal root, and then the aunt added, and then these third declension endings added on, sasia, esoncias. And just like in the third declension of nouns and adjectives, the nominative singular and the dative plural, because they have a sigma or no ending in this case, they're going to be the ones that look most different. Otherwise, this asia esoncias is going to look really familiar to you. And if you know those third declension endings well, then recognizing the case, gender, and number of participles is going to be, a total breeze. You're going to have no problem with it. And the other way that you're going to be able to recognize the case, gender, and number is by what? Yes, of course, those definite article paradigms you've learned so well. And then over here, we have asina ionisas in the endings here of the first declension. And then over here, again, we have the third declension endings. But remember that the neuter always has identical forms in the nominative and the accusative. And these always differ from what you find in the masculine. This is true in the singular and also in the plural. All right, moving on to our next one, our second aorist. So remember I said that the second aorist and the present active participles, second aorist active and present active participles are going to look really similar to one another. So I'm going to do a quick back and forth here, a flip-flop back and forth so you can see just how similar they are. Focus in on the endings here as I move back. Oh, wrong way. Notice how those endings don't change. The endings are the same. What changes is the root from lu to lip, lu to lip. So if this were to be a present active participle, it would be all of the exact same endings, but with lape instead of lip. So the exact same things are going on here. We have the third declension endings, the first declension endings, and the third declension endings with this omicron nu tau or the us added in here. And I'll make a comment really quickly on the lack of an ending here. So you don't see the sigma of the sa, sia. And that's because, remember, we talked about previously how nu and tau doesn't like to have a sigma come up against it. When it does, changes happen. So that's what's happened here, is that the tau has dropped, as has the sigma. The sigma is not there. And the omicron lengthens to... the omicron lengthens to an omega. And so down here, something similar is going on. When the sigma of the sin ending is added to the nu tau drops out because it doesn't want to be next to the sigma, and the omicron goes to an omicron hupsilon. So that may or may not be helpful. It may be more confusing to you. If so, ignore it. But that's the sort of explanation of what's gone on with the changes here. And here we go with the first aorist active indicative. Once again, you're going to see these endings look really similar to what you have previously. Notice those endings, just looking at the endings, the purple and the yellow, look really similar. That's because we both are using the first, third declension endings. They're using those same endings, but what they've added before is a little bit different. So the sa, the sigma alpha, is the sign of the aorist, the first aorist. And sorry, this first sigma should not be blue here. And then we have the nu tau running through, except for in the case of the nominative and the dative, because of those changes that happen when the nu tau interacts with the sigma. And then over here, the asina ionisas looks quite regular with the sigma alpha indicating the first aorist there. And lastly, our forms of the first aorist passive. Again, the endings all look the same. The difference comes with the morphemes here. The theta eta in the masculine and the nominative, or the theta eta iota in the feminine here. So all this to say, these endings, should you know these endings well, recognizing these things is not going to be as difficult as it might seem based on the fact that we have 5 different paradigms here. The key is going to be being able to recognize what's gone on internally and what the different parts of each participle are sort of doing. And that's where I promise I'm going to be more helpful at the end of giving you some cheat sheets and some ways to recognize these endings. But lastly, with respect to these 313 type participles, we have the perfect active participle where reduplication has happened. In this case, our reduplication is in the form of the repeated consonant with an epsilon. But remember, reduplication can come in other forms too. Specifically, it can be an epsilon, just an epsilon, if a word begins with double consonants or with a certain single consonants as well, or it can be a lengthened vowel if a verb begins with a vowel. So you're not always going to see reduplication in the form of the repeated consonant. Sometimes it's going to come in the form of an epsilon or in the form of a lengthened vowel, even when it comes to participles. So that rule, those rules about how things reduplicate hold true both for indicative verbs and for participles. In any case, We get the reduplication, we get the verbal root here, and then we get the caught in the masculine and in the neuter, and a quia in the feminine, with those third declension endings added on or the first declension endings added on. And the irregular forms are in the nominative singular and the dative singular, as is always the case in the third declension of both of nouns, of adjectives, and participles. All right, let's take a couple more deep breaths. I like doing that. That was centering for me. How about for you? Let's do it again. 3 deep breaths. In and out. In and out. In and out. All right, I'm vicariously living my dream to be some kind of exercise coach here. So what we're going to do here is the same thing we did with those 3-1-3 groups of participles with 2-1-2 groups of participles. And as a reminder, 2-1-2 means second declension endings, swain ionesus, not sasia esonsios. Remember, our second declension mnemonic is the most interesting man in the world, swain ionesus. So that's what we mean by 2-1-2 endings. And what's going to happen is these 2-1-2 endings are going to be added on to indicate the case, the gender, and the number of a participle. So with the present, middle, and passive, so these are going to be the exact same forms. The only way to know if it's middle or passive, just like with indicative verbs, is going to be the context of a sentence. With present, middle, and passive participles, we're going to have a verbal root. We're going to have a amina or an amine/amina with those endings added straight on there. For the first aorist middle participle, notice it's not middle and passive, just middle here. We're going to have the root unchanged, not a second aorist root, just the root. A sa, we're going to have those same things, mina, mine, or mina, without the omicron. So this is in the present, this serves as a connecting vowel, technically speaking. Here we don't need a connecting vowel because the sa gives us the vowel already. And then those 2-1-2 endings added on. With the second aorist middle, we're going to have almost the exact same thing, a minnow or mine, mina. So these are, again, for the masculine and the neuter, and these here are going to be for the feminine. But the only difference is going to be our second aorist root rather than an unchanged root with sa. So we're going to be using that changed root of the second aorist. And then with these two, again, notice there is no augment, and that is because why? Yep, you're right. It is because the augment only occurs in the indicative mood, that there is no augment for participles or for any of the other moods. Augment only occurs in the indicative mood. And then the last one here, I think the last one, is perfect, middle, and passive participles. So again, these are going to be the exact same form. The only way you know if it's middle or passive is based on the context of the sentence. You're going to get reduplication, which indicates the perfect. You're going to get the verbal root, and then you're going to get the minnow or mina with those 2-1-2 endings added on. So let's see what this looks like on our paradigms. I'm going to show you each one of these paradigms again. So notice we have swain ionesus right here in our red endings. And then we have asina ionesas almost completely here. We have missing here the alpha because of this, because of the eta instead. So that's the only difference we're going to have here. And then we have with the neuter, a partial swain ionesus, remembering that the nominative and the accusative of the neuter are always identical to one another. They differ from the masculine. That's true in the singular and in the plural. So what you're going to see here is that these endings are going to look like the next endings. And the change is something else added on to indicate the tense. So here our tense is present because there's nothing else added on. We just have the root. Here the tense is first aorist because that sa has been added on to these other endings that look very familiar from the present, middle, and passive. So the only difference is going to be the sa in this one. We move over to the second aorist middle participle. Notice again, that the endings, starting from the blue moving on over, look exactly the same. There's no changes there. The only change is that instead of lusa as a form of the first aorist, we have lipha. So remember, this is again from lapo. Lapo is our lexical form. So lape with the epsilon in there is the present tense root. This is the root of the verb. It changes to lip here to indicate the second aorist. So here we have the second aorist middle indicative, the tense indicated by the change of the root. And then lastly, for the forms of the perfect middle and passive, we're going to have, again, looking from main, going the wrong way here. Looking from main on over, starting with the blue, everything looks exactly the same, except for I forgot to take the red off of here. My apologies for that. Otherwise, our forms are exactly the same, except for the reduplication has been added on to indicate the perfect tense. And oh my gosh, this whole slide is a disaster. My apologies. There should be lays in front of all of these as well. This will be fixed before you have the actual PDFs of the slides in your hands, because this is a complete and utter disaster not having our reduplication there that tells us that we have what? Of course, the perfect tense. So we have reduplication, verbal root, the mina or mine, mina with those 212 endings added on there. All right, so we were to put all of these together, both those that take 313 endings and those that take 212 endings, all of our forms of the participle are going to look like this. Or I should say, all of the relevant forms of the participle for the New Testament are going to look like this. There are other forms of the participle in Koine Greek, but these are the ones that the New Testament uses, or the New Testament uses most often. So we have these different forms put into one place, and I'm going to organize this a little bit differently for you as well. So what I'm doing in these slides is organizing our information in a variety of different kinds of ways, because different people's minds sort of latch onto things in different ways. So when it comes to this participle morpheme, when we see this omicron nu tau or this us in the middle of a participle, you know you're either going to have a present active participle or a second aorist active participle. When you see sant or sas, you know it's going to be first aorist active. That sa is your hint to the first aorist. And then the nu tau or the sigma is going to be your hint to the active. The thent or the thais is going to be your first aorist passive. The theta eta, the hint to the passive and also to the first aorist there. The cot or the quia is going to be a perfect active. And all of these ones take third declension endings. Then over here, those that all take second declension endings with meno, mena, mene, or mena are going to be one of these four. So these, when you come across this in a participle, you know it's going to be one of these four. And this is a way you can sort of break down and start to go to different categories to figure out your parsing information. And this is what I'm going to give you more of in this slide here. I've also excerpted this and have it as a separate PDF for you so that it can be printable. And if you have not printed it already, I encourage you to do so before we move to a lecture pause here in a minute. So I've noted this on the Moodle page that you should print this before watching the video. But if you haven't, it will be really helpful for you, or at least have a digital copy open as you go to do the lecture pause in just a minute here. And so what this is a chart of how different participles are formed. So over here we have the tense and voice, all of our different options for the different participles. And then we have whether or not they reduplicate. That's only going to happen with perfect tense participles, you'll notice. What root they use. Second aorist is going to be used only for second aorists. And then the tense and voice morpheme along with the participle morpheme combined. So this is probably right here going to be the most relevant column for you. That when you look at a participle and you look at this column, it's going to really tell you what's going on. And in just a second here, I'll give you sort of an order of operations for identifying participles. But starting here is a good place to start. And then the endings are added on, whether it be third declension, first declension, third declension. Again, I'm sorry, I'm sounding like a broken record, but repetition is helpful for learning. Third declension for the masculine and the neuter, and first declension for the feminine participles for all of these. And then second declension for the masculine and the neuter. And then first declension for the feminine participles for all of these ones. And then here is the sort of the ultimate participle cheat sheet. The only thing it doesn't include is the syntax of participles, whether they are attributive, substantival, or adverbial. That information might be good to have on here as well. You could write that in yourself since I didn't really have room to put it there. So what you're going to do when you want to identify the parsing information for a participle is look to the morpheme, as I said, this column here, and identify which one it is. Some of these are, of course, going to overlap, and then once you have identified which one it is, if there is no overlap, you're going to already know what tense and voice you have, and you can sort of jump down to identifying the case, gender, and number in number 4. If you find that there is the same, that it's a tense and voice participle morpheme combination that covers more than one tense and voice, as in here, then you look to the root to see if it's a changed root or an unchanged root, and you can look that root up in the lexicon. Or in your vocabulary list, and if it's a second aorist root, it's going to tell you second aorist from, and if it's a present tense root, it's just going to tell you the definition for the verb, the indicative verb, that is. So you're going to get your information about the root from those places. Then check for reduplication, of course. Oftentimes this will actually be the first thing that you notice, and then you'll know that you have a perfect tense right away. And then lastly, identify the case, gender, and the number either from the definite article. So if the participle has a definite article with it, that definite article is going to be the tried and true place to go for the information about the case, gender, and number of a participle. If it does not have a definite article with it, in the case of which kind of participle? Yes, that's right, adverbial participles. You can look to the first, second, and third declension paradigms. And these are going to be in black. This is page 230 is the definite article paradigm. Page 238 is going to give you the basic endings for the first, second, and third declension, which will help you out with case, gender, and number for participles. And then down here, I've just organized again based on the morpheme, which tense and voice goes with each morpheme here. So the last thing we're going to do for this video is do a matching quiz here. So what I want you to do is just write on your whiteboard 1 through 6, and then using that cheat sheet I gave you, I encourage you to use that. I want you to match the parsing information, or so following those steps on that cheat sheet. Match the parsing information from A through F with the number over here. And while you do that, I'm going to draw some lines to each one for us. All right, and here are what the lines look like. And you know what? I should have put the letters next to the numbers as well. I'm going to go ahead and do that as well. So give me just a second. All right, that's better, huh? A, F, C, B, E, D are our answers here. Whether or not this is what you got, doing the work of this, going through that parsing worksheet sort of for the first time as you sort of get your bearings about yourself is hard work, and you deserve a high five for it. 1, 2, 3, boom, way to go. Let's just talk through these really quickly as we end this video here. So for A, number 1 is A. We have right away from our definite article, we can identify that we're going to have an accusative masculine singular. And of course, we see that reflected in the adjectival bits of our participle, the case, gender, and number. But then we also have a present active participle. And we get that from this, this ont in here, and the fact that we don't have a changed root. And this is going to be from the verb lego, I say. Then didoxthentes, we don't have a definite article to give us information here, but we see this thint in there, and this is going to be our sign to the aorist passive. That's what we get here. It's a participle, and then the ace ending, the epsilon sigma, is socia s oncias. So this is our nominative masculine plural of the third declension. So the third declension ending added on here. And then down to blepomenos, again, no article before it, but we do see this amena, I should say, participle and voice morpheme in here that's going to tell us present, middle, or passive. We don't know whether it's middle or passive until we actually have it in the wild or in the context of a sentence. And then the sigma is going to be the sigma of the second declension swain ionesus. So a nominative masculine singular. B, tain legusan. We have with tain a feminine accusative singular. And of course we have that right up here, accusative feminine singular. And then this usa is going to tell us the information of present active. Then acusas, the sas, the sigma alpha in particular, is going to tell us the aorist there. And then we have the sigma of the nominative masculine singular added on. And then the aku is just the root telling us that it's from here, so that we have an aorist active participle, nominative masculine singular. So notice there is no what here at the beginning. That's right, there's no augment because participles don't augment. Our information for the aorist is given to us in this sigma alpha here. And then lastly, ta blepomena. We have this ta, which is going to tell us that it is nominative or accusative, neuter plural. And from this amen here, we're also going to get that same present, middle, or, sorry, not that same. We're just going to get the present, middle, or passive information. We notice that the root hasn't changed. It's from blepo. And then that ah ending matches over here the ta of our neuter, nominative, or accusative plural. And I have made a terrible mistake once again. This should say not masculine. This should say nominative or accusative. That probably threw you off. I apologize. I apologize for that. I am not above mistakes, that is for sure, as this video has clearly shown. But so what we have here is a present, middle, or passive participle, neuter, plural, in the nominative or the accusative case. So based on the ta and the ending, we know it's nominative or accusative. We don't know which one. We can only determine that from the context of the sentence itself.